Thank you so much, Robin, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, everyone who's joining us today. I'll just try to be as succinct as possible. I do have an issue with, derailing. So let's hope that doesn't happen as much as possible today. I'll just be sharing my screen. Is everyone able to see?
Yes, that's coming through. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our talk today really is around navigations of relationship, with a focus on intimacy and romantic connections. But as I was working with it, really, I realized that perhaps I could have made that a bit more direct and say maybe there's a more so of rural experiences of trans and gender diverse persons, and particularly myself as a service provider. Offer psychological support to persons who are trans and their partners and their families. So a bit of a disclaimer. So that would form part of my disclaimer, that and that's a beautiful picture of me, if everyone is wondering. I am really here. I know in this space, there's a lot of professionals, people that I look up to, people whose work I'm drawing part of my talk from. And so I'm excited to be talking here today, but also just to be bringing in some knowledges from a different sort of context altogether, and perhaps getting ideas around how do I help and how do I, together with my clients, navigate some of the challenges that we're finding ourselves under as we on the journey of becoming for each and every one of them. Another disclaimer is that I'm an African male psychologist. I'm cisgender. I am queer, but of course, it does mean that most of what I'm talking about is not necessarily lived experience, but perhaps maybe coming across from clinical practice and stuff that one reads and supervision and talking to colleagues that are working in this space. With that being said, I'm going to start off by just talking about what the different types of relationships and how they've been defined. And then this is really just my thought process of how do we then land up to romantic relationships and who we are when we find ourselves within that space. So I'm going to talk about the different types that are, the personal relationships, that a personal relation, a person that has the relationship that a person has with themselves, family relationships, friendships, professional relationships, and then romantic relationships. So this slide for me is very important because it touches on the different components of what a healthy relationship has, right? And that is open and clear communication, that is trust, that is respect, that is love. It's internalized because we're going to be unpacking more of what that might entail for different persons as we go today. But this is something that I would like us to sort of hold in our heads as we think about the different types of relationships that a person may have across their different life contexts. So what are personal relationships? A personal relationship, this is a relationship that a person has with themselves. It may involve self-confidence issues, body image issues, internalized beliefs about oneself, automatic negative thoughts, life scripts, etc. And why are these important? These are important because they're telling to us about a person's self-worth, their projections, and their worldview, amongst other things. And I suppose this is the one relationship that is really paramount because we live with ourselves. This is the relationship that you'll have until the day that you're no longer with us on this earth, because we live with ourselves. And this is one of those relationships that oftentimes we find that goes neglected in people in general, but perhaps even more so for key populations, trans persons and queer persons, and particularly queer persons of color. So, the nature of a personal relationship a person has with themselves is very paramount. It's important. Is that an affirming relationship or is it disaffirming? And this can be telling because of, how one gets to this space is, of course, because of their context in which they find themselves, the family relations in which they find themselves, socioeconomic status, race. There's so many other variables that affect a way a person see themselves. Gender, today, particularly in this context, is one of those variables or those issues that affect how a person sees themselves and whether or not they have an affirming relationship with themselves, even before we start looking at the other relationships in which they form part of. So if we move over to family relationships, we know that there's different types of families. And the reason why a family relationship is important, particularly when we start looking at the work within this context in which we are seated here today, is because those early relationships, they provide early messages about the world and about who we are. Those, caregiver relationships or primary caregiver relationships have long-lasting psychological effects on people. When you think attachment theory, it is argued that, we form our attachment styles at a very young age. And so for a trans or gender diverse child, queer, even at some point, you find that in these early relationships, as they're forming these relations and bond and archetypes about who they are and what the world is, they're finding in themselves in, firstly, a predominantly heterosexual space that is not affirming, at worst, that is disaffirming to who they are viewed as being or growing up to be. And oftentimes, young queer and trans or gender diverse persons may start feeling that the world is not a safe space. And then that automatically affects how they attach to key individuals even later on in life. And the ego states, and then it goes back, it feeds into their self-worth and how one sort of sees themselves in terms of that personal relation that we were talking about. So to move from that, and we're talking about friendships and professional relationships, again, like all relationships, friendships can be beneficial. However, they can also be quite unhealthy depending on how one is able to position themselves within those particular relationships. What the research suggests, though, is that we start seeing again our attachment styles being, because they become our go-to, is almost like default. Then we go back to how we are able to attach to our friends, and that affects again those relationships in that way. But also, if we're thinking very closely about, if maybe I can reflect at this point about some of the trans clients that I've had, and what we've sort of explored when it comes to friendships is that for the first time, for majority of the persons that I've worked with, and being queer myself and having grown up in a context where perhaps it was not affirming, there was a lot of stigma, there was a lot of bullying. And when you find that now you enter into friendships, what I'm finding is that what we keep exploring with some of my clients is that, especially trans clients, is that they find themselves within queer spaces with gay or lesbian friends, but there's just something that is not sitting. There's an element that does not necessarily connect them, that they feel is not connecting holistically to who they are or their experience. And of course, we know if we're going to have difficult conversations, there's also transphobia, and it is cost-cutting, it cost-cuts even amongst certain queer communities as well. So there's also that added variable that we are always having to be aware of and sensitive to as we explore how our clients, our trans clients, navigate their space and their relationships. Professional relationships, really, those seem to take on a different sort of face altogether, because it's about being present, it's about producing the work. But if already I have issues about my self-worth and whether or not I can contribute, that affects group participation, teamwork. At some points, it doesn't affect management styles. And if the workspace in which I find myself in is not affirming or is not sensitive or tailored to some of our needs, then it becomes even more problematic and potentially re-traumatizing for some people. So to get to the crux of my talk today, which is about romantic relationships. When we talk about relationships, there's a sense that defining the word love in and of itself becomes quite tricky because it's one of those terms that could and is experienced by different people in different ways. And so my attempt today is to just perhaps give a bit of a glimpse of how oftentimes I work with it. So let's see some of the issues that arise there. So literature suggests that romantic relationships are defined as relationships based on emotional and physical attraction, potentially leading to long-term intimate relationships. They're often a hallmark of significant area of individual's life. The quality and the satisfaction of the romantic relationships can be affected by many different factors, such as age, individuals, self-esteem, personality, attachment style, as we've sort of touched on, amongst other things. But also research argues that, there's so many benefits that at a social, interpersonal, and psychological level that are inherent from having healthy romantic relationships. But there are some challenges. I know they say same, but that's meant to be some challenges. Studies have reported that only around half of the romantic relationships for transgender individuals survive through gender-affirming transition. This may, of course, be concerning to the transgender individual who are in the process of initiating gender-affirming transitions, or taking up gender-affirming healthcare. With regards to romantic relationships, transgender individuals may face challenges within several different aspects of their relationships, including finding partners, disclosing to partners, and maintaining relationships. Oftentimes in this rural context where I find myself, you find that even the language, the issues of languaging around what does it mean to be trans starts becoming problematic, and they become added variables for clients in terms of initiating relationships and finding relationships. The issue of disclosure is very much linked to violence and stigma also, right? Particularly within the context in which I find myself working in, where, for a trans feminine person who passes within certain spaces, for them to then disclose to a potential male partner who they don't know is something not to be taken lightly, because that can be life-threatening. So when to disclose and how to disclose becomes a huge issue in most of my trans clients' lives, and negotiating and navigating that is always challenging. Maintaining relationships also is one area of concern, as literature suggests, and I hope we get the time to speak to that. What the literature is suggesting is that additionally, for partners, individuals may begin to question their own identity or sexual orientation. They can be overwhelmed by the others' transitioning related factors, including navigating new gender roles and relationship dynamics. And I'm hoping that I get an opportunity to speak to how I, in practice, with my clients, we are able to speak to some of these challenges that have been highlighted. As a new therapist in this space, in the area, I have found the practice guidelines for psychology professionals to be very helpful for me in just guiding my interaction with my clients. Please, Robin, help me with time also, just maybe. Practice guidelines for psych. So I know it's very colorful. That was because when I was thinking about this and I was trying to work on this slide, I wanted to highlight some of the guidelines that I felt, especially when talking about relationships, I found them to be useful. And to my surprise, at least once, I've had to tackle one of these guidelines. Of course, as professionals, as health professionals, we have to work in a non-discriminatory way. We have to allow individuals to be determining. And I will come back to this because oftentimes when clients present to us, they're presenting already in distress, and you find that it almost is a knee-jerk reaction for a therapist to want to make the pain go away or to want to make the challenges go away. And when we do that, we run a risk of overshadowing what is the true intent of the consultation. What is the client wanting from that interaction or consultation? And then the other guidelines really speak to us as professionals, calling us to be aware of the normative social context, aware of the intersecting discriminations when we're talking intersectionality. How do we counteract stigma and violence in which our clients find themselves in? Recognizing multiple developmental pathways that, a lot of our theories that we use, even attachment theory, they don't not necessarily have their roots from within our context. And sometimes they may not speak to the different alternative local knowledges about developmental pathways in which our trans and queer people find themselves, using or utilizing as they navigate their daily life. So all the guidelines, in essence, are very important. And perhaps for me, for this talk, how necessary it is for us to always take an affirmative stance when working with trans and gender diverse persons. So usually what I do after having sat with a client and listened to the narrative and really started unpacking it, because by that time, when a person is seated with us, they have been able to navigate, right? They've navigated life up until the point that they're now sitting with you. And we have to give credit to their resilience and their lived experiences, because that's what's guided them to finding us in the first place. And so there's going to be things, I believe, in each person's life that take away certain privileges, but also there's certain personality or personal characteristic that provide some privileges. And this is really a process. I like this wheel of power and privilege because it sort of helps us track what resources a person might have, what experiences and how they've navigated those challenging experiences. Because really, to tailor make any sort of intervention, we need to take account a huge part of what the lived experience is, particularly within a set context. So we have to think about intersectionality and how the different which levels of oppression still exist for a certain person, and what resources do they have to navigate those or to lessen their impact. For instance, for me, oftentimes there's a challenge that there's lack of access to healthcare, to affirming healthcare. There's human rights violations that happen. There's challenges for some of my clients in terms of going to report the violence and the stigma against them. So, but what's there? What can they use? What's available? It helps to know what they've used in the past to sort of shield themselves and work around the challenges that exist, because that then becomes maybe a mind map for us as we continue working. So to move then from that point, it's usually what I like to do is to think about romantic relationship or love in this way. I often use the triangular theory of love by Steinbeck. And in this way, what Steinbeck does is he conceptualizes romantic relationships or romantic love as a social construct, and how he works with it is that he deconstructs it into three parts. The first component being intimacy, and according to the theory, intimacy refers to feelings of closeness, connectedness, and is represented really by the emotional aspect of love, right? It is the desire to promote the welfare of the loved one, to experience, when one experiences happiness with the loved one, has high regard with the loved one, has mutual understanding. So that is what this particular component is looking at. And the other component then of love, as it is being deconstructed by Steinbeck, is passion. And passion really is about what it sounds like. It is that motivation. It's motivational. It encompasses romance, attraction, and sex, and all the associated behavioral aspects of that. It is that intense longing with the union with the other person. And then the third component, I'm rushing through this, is the decision and commitment. This is was reconceptualized. Initially it was seen as commitment, but also now in the later writings, there's the decision component, where it is about choosing to be with this other person. It is almost that cognitive awareness, where you say, this is a person that I want to be in a relationship with. This is a person that I'm choosing to spend the however long with. So then we are looking at that point in time where we're talking about commitment and saying, I'm committed to staying in this relationship. So I like to sit and say, let us explore in the relationships that you've had some of these components, or in the relationship that you currently have, whether or not any of these components are present. And, continuing to work with this theory, it results into about 8 cases of love, which I'm going to go into. I know that these slides are quite wordy, but what Steinbeck then does is he reconstructs the concept of love into 8 different types of love types. And this is non-love, where simply there's none of the components that we spoke about. There's liking, which results when one experiences only intimacy with a partner. So this is an instance where perhaps I'm not committed to being in this relationship. I do not have, a lustful sort of feeling, but I do feel that I can share parts of myself that are deeper, and I have high regards for my partner, but not necessarily committed to being, say, maybe monogamous. And then there's infatuated love, which results from experiencing the passion component in the absence of, I suppose, then commitment and intimacy. There's empty love, which emanates from the decision that one loves another and is committed to that love in absence of both intimacy and passion. So this really you see in couples where they've decided to stay because they've committed to staying, not necessarily that they may still feel any sort of close connection with their partner or any physical longing or lust anymore. Then there's romantic love, which derives from a combination of intimacy and passion. There's compassionate love, which derives from combination of intimacy and decision, but perhaps the lack of passion there. And flactuous love, which results from a combination of passion and decision components in the absence of intimacy. Then we have the sort of what the literature calls the gold standard, where there's all of those 3 components are present within a particular romantic relationship. So for me, this sort of helps, because when one works with concepts such as trust, such as love, it can become quite tricky to know then what a person is referring to. But this, for me, I found that it sort of simplifies our experiences and has the potential to acknowledge what's there, instead of downplaying what isn't there, but to acknowledge the different components that are present within a set relationship. So this takes us back to I think it was second or third slide that we had, and I'd said it was very important because you can have all these components, but for a person to be able to access them, there still needs to be, communication, there still needs to be trust, there still needs to be respect, whichever type of love you find yourself in at that particular time. And what I found, particularly in my context, is that different people will be okay with having different types of loving relationships with their partners for different reasons. Some people may feel that in their journey of becoming, of affirming who they are not yet ready to invite at an intimate level a stranger, or they may feel they may not be ready to be committed to a person because they're also figuring themselves out. There's changes in their bodies, that they're experiencing, and perhaps for the first time they feel that they are well with themselves, that they are willing to explore without the pressure of having to account to another person. And for us service providers, really our place is to meet our clients where they are and explore with them their navigations and the reasons that underpin certain choices. And, and do this within a space that allows and facilitates self-actualization and helps us grow also as therapists. When we're looking at, we also have to think about partners, and how does one work with partners within that particular space, as I sort of touched on briefly, to say that one might feel, partners may start feeling like they're left out in the process. So helping partners with language, using affirmative language, being more congruent with their emotions, openness, accountability, trust, respect, providing safety, providing a space, and making appropriate referrals, to sex therapists, to sexologists, to social workers, to medical doctors, to other psychologists, to people that are willing to provide couple therapy and couples counseling. All of that then becomes our sort of, as health providers, our role, into saying that these are some of the things that are available, these are some of the resources that are available, and that our clients then can take them up as they navigate their spaces and as they navigate their romantic relationships. Of course, all relationships are difficult and all relationships are unique because each and every one of us bring ourselves, we bring our attachment styles, we bring our early messages about who we are and the world into the relationship. And so things such as communication cannot be downplayed, things such as trust cannot be downplayed, and respect cannot be downplayed within relationships. So I'm rushing to get to one of the other important things because I also want us to sort of have time to discuss and that I can learn from everyone's experiences. I want to talk about some abuses that happen within, because that is unfortunately the bulk of what I end up seeing. There's emotional abuse within romantic relationships, as good as they can be for people, but there can also be emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And particularly for some of my clients, when one has found themselves in spaces that are so disaffirming that you become desensitized to perhaps the violation and the violence. It also goes back to, self-worth issues. It also goes back to how one sees themselves and their own personal relationship that they have with themselves, other healthy relationships that they may have with family or friends or professionals. So this is one area really where we need as service providers to be just sensitive in terms of how our clients are navigating space and how much of the violations, of current violations, are they letting go of because, they may be feeling like they're not worth more than what they're getting, or this is the biggest piece of the pie that they're going to get. With that being said, I would like to open up for some discussions. Thank you so much.